Hello everybody. Thanks for looking at this episode of the Matt Finance Show. Today is a bit different to what we've been doing in the past. So we've been doing quite a lot of stories from Matt Finance leaders around their journey, around their systems, and how they've evolved the finance function of their Matt. Today we're joined by Leanda from Maritime Academy Trust, who has actually been involved in a merger of two trusts over the past 12-18 months, and Leanda's going to talk some details about that, but we're going to be quite specific about the top to bottom of the merger process with the kind of re-emphasis on the academisation programme. There's a lot of our customers and a lot of conversations I have around growth and mergers, so we really wanted to just unpick what it actually is and what it looks like from somebody who's been there, done it, lived it, pulled their hair out over it over the past 12-18 months, to just get a feel for all of those things that have happened, worked well, what didn't work well, and then any lessons we can take as well. So as we start, Leanda, thank you very much for joining us today. To start, would it be possible for you to just introduce yourself, your background, and also how you got into the world of Matt Finance, please?
Of course. So I'm Leanda Arnold. I work for Maritime Academy Trust. I got into the world of Matt Finance through starting what I thought was a job that would give me that balance of work and family life. As a finance officer in a single school that was a local authority school, so a nice simple job that fitted in with the school runs and everything else. Didn't last that long doing that because I put my hand up and offered to do more and more. Became business manager for that school, and then that school was the lead school when we converted into a multi-academy trust. Other schools joined us soon after, so we found ourselves very quickly in a trust of 4 schools, including a special school, and from there 3 years later we merged with Maritime Academy Trust, and I've the job of Chief Financial Officer there.
Wow. So could you, so Chief Financial Officer for Maritime Academy Trust, which is the merged trust. Could you just give a bit of background and introduce the trust and what the trust looks like, and perhaps the reasons for that merger?
Yeah, so Maritime is a trust of 13 primary schools. One of those is a special school, and some of the other schools have specialist provisions within them. We are in Medway, Kent, Bexley and Greenwich local authorities. And the idea of the merger was that we'd bring together the strengths of both of the trusts to form something that was more sustainable and more collaborative across those regions. So it came from both a financial and an educational background.
Okay. Was there a pre-existing relationship there, or was that kind of a CEO relationship? Was it trustees, or how did that kind of meeting of trusts happen?
Yeah, so our CEOs used to meet up. Our trustees had relationships with each other through governance. So it was both, actually.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, we're not going to focus too much on mergers from the general merger side, but the question we always get is, how do you do it? You've got 2 CEOs and you end up with not 2 CEOs. What was the story there in the CEO, especially as they were friendly before? Was that part of the planning?
Yeah, I think the trustees were looking. I mean, if you're going to grow and you're going to merge, ultimately you are going to have one CEO. So for me, that was for the trustees to look at and to decide on how that went forwards. It worked for us because Nick, the CEO of Maritime, became interim CEO of Barnsdale Primary Trust. So we were able to establish those relationships with Nick and the Maritime team a lot earlier than we would have done in a normal merger.
Okay, so it was almost a trial of CEO.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, and then what did that? So from the very beginning to, was it September last year that they merged? What was that process like in terms of both time frame? Can you just run us through kind of the timeline of events from the very beginning to ultimately merging on September 2020?
So a week before our first COVID lockdown, I was at a master's course, and I got a phone call from our chair of trustees to let me know that this was happening. Before that, we hadn't heard anything. So very quickly, we were then introduced to Nick, and we then went into lockdown. So all of the anxiety around what's going to happen, how's it going to work, the due diligence process, the change process, the merging of the teams, all happened through lockdown.
So as part of that process, then, yeah, we're going to talk about the finance teams and how the finance teams were merged a bit later on in the chat. But you're now CFO of the merged trust. Was that a relatively early decision in the process, and how did that come about?
Yeah, it was. So Terry, the CFO of Maritime, was retiring. So I was really lucky because we were able to work together over the summer months through the due diligence and be able to gain some understanding before Terry left. So it was quite a nice handover.
Okay. Yeah. And in terms of that due diligence, what did that look like? So you were, I'm becoming CFO. I'm inheriting, albeit you were joining the trust that was keeping the name. You're inheriting a set of budgets and assumptions. What did that DD process look like, and how much comfort or kind of insight were you able to gain in that period?
So it was interesting because it was a merger. We were doing due diligence on each other. So it was almost like a game of tennis. So you provide this and I'll provide that, and you provide this and I'll provide that. And we were almost doubling up on everything we did for each other, which was good, but it also showed the different ways that we both worked.
Yeah.
So we were able to identify quite early on that we actually worked in quite different ways in some areas, one of which was the budgeting process and the tools that we use.
Yeah. Okay. So back to double DD. I can't think of anything worse than double DD or DD on yourself. I suppose knowing that your trust was, your position was going to be at Maritime, and the trust coming into Maritime was your trust. I guess that meant your focus was on the other trust in terms of your confidence on the numbers, because I guess you had a pretty good understanding of your own numbers, and it was focused the other way.
Yeah, and we also instructed auditors.
But interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, we also instructed auditors to do some due diligence work for us as well, just to dot the I's and cross the T's.
Yeah. And what did that look like? Because I often get asked about DD in terms of what's the right level of DD, and ultimately it is how much do you want to pay for it. DD can go to at the nth degree, but it's ultimately a view's got to be taken on sufficient DD. And how did you kind of come up with what sufficient DD was in this process?
So our auditors were instructed to start at top level and work down. And I'd say that we started in the detail to gain confidence in the detail that was in there and worked up.
Yeah.
And we kind of met somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, because I guess the time is in the detail. It was that the thought process behind that. Actually, the time and the nitty gritty was in the detail. So as auditors' time has a direct cost, whereas your time there's still a cost to it, but it's a sunk cost because it's staff cost, that a lot of the detailed DD was then yourselves, and it was topped and tailed, and assurances then given by the auditors.
Yeah, and we were trying to look at the detail of the budgets and how they were set, and if they were coming in on budget, whereas at the top level they were looking at balance sheets and audited accounts, and they were working down and identifying areas from there on both sides.
Okay, so a different lens in one sense. It was on kind of current position, and yours was more around future direction. Current position was important, but future direction was your focus.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Would you say that process, because there was obviously a long process, not as long as it perhaps might have been, and COVID kept you busy in those times as well. Would you say the process is now finished? or where would you say you are in that process, but before saying, yeah, we are one trust, we're no longer merging, we've kind of ironed out those kinks that needed looking at?
I think the due diligence part is finished, but bringing together the team, the systems, the processes, I think is phase one is done.
Yeah.
And we're now on to phase two. So as an example, subscriptions always creep out of the woodwork as people sign up for 3 years and suddenly you realise that you're in year 3 and you didn't realise that before and it wasn't in the budget. So there's always things that will come out later on, but I think we're done on phase one now.
Okay. In terms of the teams and the people side, I imagine systems and processes have their own challenges, but people have unique challenges because people are people, and that's something you can't just do with spreadsheets and risk assessments and things like that. What did the teams look like pre-merger? What was the process to then look at what a structure might look like post-merger? And any kind of challenges or opportunities and kind of good results along the way from that?
I'd start by saying that the people from both sides are fantastic. Some of them don't even know how good they are, and some of them have adapted really well to new jobs. So in the maritime schools, they had previously had business managers that were working across 2 or 3 schools. In the Barnsley side, we had taken business managers out of schools. Office managers were in schools, but a team of 3 of us were working centrally, doing orders, invoicing, and all of the accounting that goes with that. So we had quite different models.
Yeah.
We've now changed to a model where we've got a team of finance officers and a team of the people that were the business managers previously, but they've moved into more specialist roles. So we've got the finance officers have been split as well, because we found that they were trying to look at income and they were trying to look at purchasing, and that was just meaning that they were all really struggling time-wise. So we've created some clarity there, and we've split the finance officers into purchase ledger and sales ledger, as it would be.
Yeah.
That has enabled them to have focus on their roles and to really understand their roles,
yeah.
Not just to be somebody that's just pressing buttons, so that they really get to understand that role and understand the needs of the schools and how we can help them. Yeah. So because of that, we've got a team of finance officers on purchase ledger, and we've got a finance officer on sales ledger. Phase 2, we're now starting to learn each other's jobs in those roles, so that we've got more cover when we have holidays and things. With the rest of us, we now work as a team with different functions. So somebody looks after the bank, somebody looks after supporting the school admin teams, somebody looks after the nitty-gritty accounting work. And then we all work as a 4, setting the budgets and monitoring the budgets with schools. So we do that in pairs. And then when it comes to the budget setting time of year as now, we start to then look at each other's budgets. So we sense check each other's pairs of budgets as well. So that starts to give us an overview of the whole trust without one school being reliant on one person.
Yeah, okay. And was that something that you'd already had eyes on doing in the previous role at Barnsley? Is that you tried something else and actually because of the scale it was a challenge, or was that the deliberate kind of setup from day one?
I think it was the way that I intended going day one. Yeah. Because we'd seen it work at Barnsley and we knew that it was scalable. Yeah. But it is a culture change to move from serving 1 or 2 schools to actually having an overview of perhaps income for the whole trust. But actually, I think we've adapted really well, and to be able to do that whilst working from home through COVID, where the support is always harder to give and receive.
Yeah.
I think the team have done an amazing job.
Yeah. Well, yeah, they certainly have. I suppose that brings us on to talking about COVID and remote working, and I get far too excited about this subject, is then the systems piece. So people to one side, they've been heroic in terms of, changing their roles and coping with things. On the systems piece, what did the systems landscape look like in the two trusts prior to the merger?
So in Barnsdale, we'd used a budget software. In Maritime, they'd used spreadsheets, and there was a lot more spreadsheet analysis that went through in Maritime, whereas we relied on our systems to produce the data at Barnsdale. Yep. For me, IMP was key in this because it enabled us to start on a new piece of software together that we all learned at the same time, that we then were able to identify the things that we didn't know for each line of income, for example. Yeah. So at Barnsdale, we didn't have any Greenwich schools, so we didn't know how the Greenwich funding model worked. And likewise, a special school wasn't in Maritime, so they then had to learn how a special school worked. So I think that was really key, and it's all starting to work together quite early on. Yeah. And it was new to us all, so it was a new beginning for the entire team.
Yeah, and what was the point where you realised that there was a system change required? Because obviously you had a system that was working for you. Maritime had spreadsheets analysis, but that was working for them. Did you investigate both of those first and then look at alternatives, or had you already made your mind up around we're getting these challenges with X number of schools, with Y number of schools, that's going to be compounded?
Yeah, even with the software with Barnsdale, it was a challenge every time something changed that we had to go into every single school and change. Yeah. And so this is why IMP works for us, is because we make a change once. Again, with individual spreadsheets for individual schools, we come up against exactly the same problem. And so, you've only got to forget to go into one school and change something, and you're back to square one again. I have an innate fear of macros in spreadsheets. They're okay for the person that wrote them, but I didn't write them, and there's a reliance there. So I was very aware of that as well.
Okay, so changing systems in this process, and whether it's with the IMP switch or any other, if you were going to do that process all over again, what would be your advice, or what would you do differently, and what would be your advice to others that are about to rip out their current systems and put in a brand new shiny tool?
Do it at the right time. We were lucky because we knew that the merger was almost guaranteed to go ahead in September. It was the right time for us. It gave us time to then work and put the budgets in and to start to understand those budgets. So it gave us a really early understanding of it. Yeah. So whilst it's hard in the summer holidays, you just need to rip the plaster off and go for it.
And that we see that because, with finance systems, everybody wants to go September. With budgeting, planning and forecasting, it flips to kind of April. There's no worse time to do it because it's firstly, the rest of the sector wants to do it in April, so it's a real challenge. But the nice thing about doing it in September, October, November is, firstly, your budget doesn't move massively over the summer. So you've got an approved budget at the end of July, and it's probably the only time of the year really where it gets put down for a period of time, so you've not got a moving target. So that's one benefit. And the second benefit is when you do go live in October, November, December, your first kind of reforecasting cycles, well, it's November or October or December, and they're not that important. As long as the next one is better than this one, by the time you then get to March, which is the important forecast, because that's what drives the BFRO, you then 6 forecasts, 3, 4, 5 forecasts in, and you've ironed out all of the alignment issues, all the ease of use issues. So I'm glad it was seen as a good time, because we try and kind of echo that with customers, and it's always difficult because there's never a good time to do anything. But if the best bad time, I mean, every time's a bad time. That's a bit of a given, isn't it? But the least bad time is probably that summer switch, early part of the academic year, and that's something that I think is changing. But we would wholeheartedly echo that.
Yeah, and the other part is the staffing changes. Over the summer, you pretty much know what you're going to start with in September. So again, those staffing changes are so minimal to start with, and that's quite a nice place to start when you're training, to do a few changes, but not too many in the early days, and to understand those kinds of things first before you then move on to other things. So the forecasting side was a learning curve for not only us, but our heads as well. But it's given them much more visibility than they ever have had before in terms of looking forwards.
Yeah.
We always talk about monitoring to budgets looking backwards, and we've completely flipped our focus this year to looking forwards at where we're going to end up at the end of the year, not what did we do wrong with our budget setting last year. And that forecasting is the major item that we're using this year when we're looking to next year's budgets. We're not looking back at budgets that were set 13 months ago.
Okay, so that's interesting, because you've obviously landed a new role, you've done loads of DD in both directions. How close or not was that to them? Because then what you inherit, as you said, with subscriptions, but I'm sure all sorts of things come out of the woodwork for a whole variety of reasons, misaligned assumptions. I expect you found some of those things, but how much did you have to then in year react to things cropping up that perhaps weren't fully anticipated or understood in that DD and inheriting those budgets?
I think because we've got the visibility of it, that's okay, because we can adjust to them in year. I think because we're looking at that detailed line by line forecast on a monthly basis, if something like that does pop up, it's not such a major issue, because we can then reforecast and we can then know where we're not going to pull back on expenditure in another area. So it's made a difference in that sense too.
So you're not trying to, because we get this, we get, do we just try and agree to budget? We're trying to get our actuals to agree to the budget. It was almost, well, the budget was set, there was challenges around that budget for all sorts of reasons. We've got a bottom line target that we're aiming for in terms of X amount surplus or deficit, but is that your primary focus in terms of then how that fits within those lines? Less concerned, and trustees are happy with that?
Yeah, I think we've got to, first of all, get to balanced budgets, and we've got to get to a place where our heads understand those budgets. And I think that has really moved in a positive direction this year. I think until you start to get that, the budgets will then, that are set in future years, will get better and better. But at a point when so much has been changing and we're aligning systems and processes across two trusts, you have to do that piece of work first, and it's inevitable that there are going to be different approaches from each side.
And do you find that, I've had some feedback from CFOs around, by a monthly forecast process, actually, it doesn't have to be perfect. A forecast is a best guess. Okay, so it's, okay, this is our best guess right now, and the next one will be better, and the next one will be better, and the next one will be better. So almost don't sweat the small stuff in terms of getting correct management accounts, because it's a point in time estimate. And is that a change of kind of approach or focus that you'd had and probably drilled into you in school finance worlds that you've kind of embraced this year?
I think budgets are set at a point in time, and we do our very best at that point in time with our crystal balls to get the very best that we can at that point. But the forecasting is a moving target that we can refine every single month, and we can look in different areas in different months as well. So we tend to only spend about an hour with each school, and we might drill into a certain area, we might drill into income, we might drill into curriculum expenditure. And as we're starting to drill into different areas on a monthly basis, we're then starting to refine the whole.
Yeah. And do you still compare that back to approved budget, or this year with everything that's been going on, is that still something you do?
We do. It's there in the background.
Yeah.
But I'd say the focus on forecasts this year has been more important, that we reach the intended outturn that we want to at the end of the year.
And what's your view? So I spoke to some trusts recently, and we're working with some do exactly the same. They set the budget, and we all know the budget is set with not all the information. Okay, so it's your best estimate at that point, and then 3 months later, it's wildly wrong because you've got teacher pay awards and a number of other, and especially in the last 12 months with COVID, I mean, who knows what could have been changed. But we've seen some trusts say, well, look, and therefore I don't want to report against that on a month-by-month basis because it's so historic, because of there might be some fundamental differences in terms of TCAF grant, or some big chunky changes. So therefore what they've got is they've got an approved budget, which is the fixed budget that was BFR trustee approved. And then perhaps once a term, they've also got another scenario, which is their approved revised budget. So once a term, they revisit that with the trustees' approval, bearing in mind all of the changes that have been made. So they're not, and that's then their comparison point. So they compare to their revised budget. It's not that they're making the actuals agree to the budget. So that's a very different thing. But it's right. Well, that was the budget. There was these fairly big things that changed in that period. Therefore, this reflects that change, and so on and so forth. Is that something that you've considered or thought about or heard of?
I think that that's something that we would likely do in the future if there were significant changes.
Yeah.
I think there's limited value in reworking a budget to try and make it match our actuals.
Yeah.
There is more value in changing it if there are significant changes that you hadn't anticipated first time around.
And that's the balance, isn't it, where you draw the line between making it match and avoiding the big variances that are explained, because there's no point seeing variance after variance after variance, the same variance every single month. Do you also compare your current forecast to your last month's forecast, and how much of your kind of presentation to trustees is around, well, this is what's changed since last month, it doesn't really matter where we are against the budget, this is the relevant thing, this is where we said we'd be last month, this is now where we say we're heading this month?
Yeah, that's included in our management accounts pack.
Yeah.
But more this year, I would say, to show our progress on using it.
Okay.
I think next year the narrative around it will start, but I think this year it's been more around evidencing that we are refining our understanding, and the heads are refining their understanding and making those decisions in year as we go forwards.
And is that, in terms of the information they need to help their understanding, is that changing as you go as well, or are they happy with what they're getting, or what does that look like?
Yeah, they've all got their own read-only logins. They all self-serve with reporting. They will ask us if they want to drill down into a certain area. But for me, having the budget, the forecast and the actuals to date in one place for them, that gives them that summary overview without them having too much detail to wade through, is kind of pitched at the right level for them, to be able to see what they need to see, but not have to wade through piles and piles of reporting. Yeah,
and it's getting the right balance between giving too much information, probably more so for trustees. There are some trustees, and I'm sure I won't ask you to comment on whether it's your trustees or not, but there's some trustees, if you give the information, there will be questions, whether it's, it might drop out of the strategic into the operational, and it's really key to just try and not get to that level of conversation, because it can spiral. If you do present too much information, it might invite questions that are perhaps not that relevant. But I won't ask you to comment on whether that's applicable to your trustees. Winding kind of the clock back to 1st September, at that point, did you have kind of a 90-day, 180-day plan in terms of, right, this is what I've got to get sorted, these are my priorities over the next 3 months? What were those priorities, if there were some?
So we had to, half of us had to learn a new finance system. All of us had to learn a new budgeting system. We had a bit of a backlog that we had to work through, that had happened over the summer prior to the merger. And obviously we had all the tying up to do of 2 external audits and 2 year ends and all of those submissions that go with those. So we were doubling up on everything we were doing as well.
Well, and that's something that can probably not forgotten, but it's not that always that obvious, is that with 2 trusts that merge, there's a close down of the old trusts, and that's not a insignificant piece of work. Is that right?
That is absolutely right. Yeah, you do everything twice.
Yeah. And was it a case of, well, it's just a normal year-end audit for that trust and then that's done and it's closed? Or are there any extra steps or different steps involved because it's the final audit opposed to a normal year-end process?
No, it's pretty similar.
Yeah.
I think it's just about what happens with those figures at year end. They then need merging into the one system afterwards.
Yeah. And you played a blinder doing the close down on the 31st of August. I bet you were. Was there any risk it was going to be 1st of October or anything like that, and you were pushing back firmly, or was that date set and not too challenged?
I think that's the reason that we answered all the due diligence so quickly, because none of us wanted it to roll into another year.
No, of course, because that would have ultimately been 3 audits. You'd have had the 2 audits for end of August and then the close down audit for whenever that date was. So yeah, that must have been a nervy, but especially with everything that was going on last year. I mean, I imagine that was no means a given in terms of it's definitely going to happen on that date.
No, and thank goodness for being able to talk to people through screens. We were lucky that both trusts had a decent setup on being able to access that information virtually.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a major problem for any of us to be able to start working from home.
Yeah.
Had it have been completely paper-based at that point, we would have been really, really struggling.
Yeah. What does that office kind of work from home, work in office balance look like at the moment now for the finance team across Maritime?
At the moment, we're in for 2 core days a week.
Yeah.
And those core days are really important. They're about building the team. They're about, oh, can you just tell me how to do this? Or can you just tell me how to do that? And those conversations are so much easier when you're face to face. The days that we're at home, we tend to get chunkier pieces of work done because we're able to just focus for an hour or so on a certain project. But it's meant that we can't get into the schools necessarily. So all of our meetings with heads, we haven't still been to some of the schools.
Wow.
We talk to the heads virtually, but we haven't actually met them in person.
Yeah. Do you see that there will be a meeting schedule of, well, these are face-to-face meetings, and will that be driven by the topic of the meeting rather than the duration, or how do you see that kind of playing out?
Yeah, I think going forwards, we will probably stick with some sort of a hybrid model of meeting some of the heads virtually, because some transactional conversations are just as easy, like a forecasting meeting is just as easy, probably for most months, across the screen. It would have been nice to be able to have more of the budgeting meetings face to face, because you want to point at things and you want to adjust things. And whereas before we would have probably gone into one of the schools for a whole day and just blasted the entire budget in a day, we're picking off different areas remotely. So we're picking off income, we're picking off premises costs, we're picking off different areas across all schools at the same time. So we're approaching it slightly differently this year, because really and truly the heads want to know what they want to spend on curriculum. They're not really interested in what it costs to get a boiler serviced.
Yeah. And so on that budget, so it's the first budgeting period at the moment, we're in the thick of it. So today we're in June. How much, because I guess changing a budgeting system is similar to a zero-based budget approach. It's not quite the same because you do start with data, but you are completely reviewing the data set before it goes into the system. And that combined with then the monthly forecasting, has that helped you in terms of you get into budget, but because you've been doing it monthly, this is ultimately an extension of the monthly forecast cycle?
Yeah, because so let's say a school has overspent on agency supply for whatever reason. Let's say they had 7,000 in their budget and they've spent 40 this year. We're putting 40 in next year's budget as the starting point for the conversation. So the conversation is, have you put 40 in there because I spent that last year? Absolutely, yes, that's why we've done that. So most of them are starting off in a deficit position, so that they can then make those choices about where it is that they want to save money and where it is they want to spend money. So those conversations are more useful because we're starting by pulling some of the forecast overspends in to be able to start the conversations.
And that's something we're probably not where we want to be on that, but there's been historically too often we see, well, this budget when you prepare your new budget and give to trustees, that's put next to last year's budget. Whereas actually both of those are guesses. So you're showing a guess versus a guess and showing it as context. Or at least with a forecast, that's, it's still a guess, but it's much less of a guess, certainly as the year progresses. So, this time of year, you've got 9 months of actuals and then 3 months of guesses, of which probably not a lot is going to happen in the following 3 months. And that, I guess, has shone a difference on the last year's budget versus the forecast. And that just means you're addressing it now rather than 9 months into next year when you realise that the budget perhaps wasn't the best.
Yeah, and we've got an order deadline in June, so that when we bring in June's actuals into the forecast, we can pretty much guarantee where that is then going to end at the end of the year. So we can then do a double sense check. We'll have first draft budgets done by then, but then we can do a sense check at that point, looking at the forecast for this year and the budgets for next year, to see if there's any gaping holes that we've missed.
Yeah. And where do you think what are the key things that you're looking at your outturn now? Where would you say the biggest shifts are between where you're going to end up and where you thought you were going to end up? Are there some key things that just were missed in DD, or it was different, it turned out differently?
It tends to, more than anything, be an agency supply for those unforeseen staffing issues that come along. And sometimes we use an agency supply to start with, but then they turn into a permanent member of staff. So there's a bit of a lag in the coding to start with. But that's probably one of the main areas that we're identifying at the moment.
I suppose it's worth pointing out the budget last year was 3 months into COVID, and there's been COVID. So in terms of agency, it's probably not been a normal year in terms of how you might, especially in your area. I guess Christmas time was a period that was quite involved, and so I suppose it's helped. Agency is always a candidate that we see kind of get out of step in the year compared to the budget, but having that monthly approach to it just means you're going into the next year as informed as you can be. But agency is the emergency line, isn't it? If things happen, that's going to be the line so it's not necessarily planned.
And I guess the other big one this year is lettings. So we haven't been able to let as we would normally. So that's got to be built back up over time again now. Yeah,
that takes some doing. Okay, so just getting to the end of the session now. I've got a couple of questions to finish. I've just got a few, making sure that I've covered everything we wanted to. Looking back at your design or thought process in the summer of how you thought the merger would go and how you were going to operate, what would you say are the key differences now that aren't what you thought it would be? So therefore things that you started in one way and you've changed. Are there any of those areas that are jumping out?
I thought that we'd all be in the office all the time, but actually even within that, I think that the way we work going forwards will always now change. That there'll be a core of people that are in the office for most of the time, and some of us will be out and about more, but equally we might be in the office more because we can have more of these kind of conversations across the screen, and we don't need to travel as much as we would have thought we needed to.
Okay, and then lastly, just to finish then, so the next 12 months, what are your kind of priorities across the finance function for the coming 12 months after a pretty busy last 12 months?
Well, I'd say we've completed phase 1 of our development, so it is now about crossing over each other's roles, understanding each other's roles, and identifying as a team what we can do better, how we can help our schools more, what support we need to put into our heads, and we're looking at a training program for our heads so that they get a better understanding of finance going forwards, especially for our new and upcoming heads.
Okay, so systematically and practically it's landed and the structures are there, and it's really kind of embedding and making the existing processes better and stronger, but you're in a good place structurally. It's just to focus on doing those a bit better and a bit more effectively and collaboratively, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, perfect. Is there anything that you look back on and think, I wish we hadn't done that? You know, if anybody else starting their merger process think, whatever you do, don't do what we did, which was X, Y, and Z.
Well, I'll flip it and I'll say I wish I knew more about change management. I
Yep.
wish I knew more about people's worries around change, and how deeply embedded they are.
Mm.
I think actually it was even harder this year because a face-to-face conversation really can allay fears that you cannot allay across the screen. But yeah, I wish I'd known more about the change management process, and how to approach it. I think we did a lot right. I think we did a lot right that we talked a lot and we tried to understand people's strengths. But even within that, you know, you cannot put a price on people's worries.
No, no, that's really difficult. And you suffered it being in a global pandemic. I mean, that I'm sure behind a lot of the challenges you had, that COVID didn't help. But you know, it's something we often find that a lot of the thought, because it's mechanical, you can put thought into the processes, you can put thought into the systems, but you can't be methodical and mechanical on people, because people are people. And it's something that we hear time and time and time again, that that's the bit that would have been done differently. However, it's still difficult. Often I ask, well, how would you have done differently? And you know, communication is generally the thing that comes out, but beyond that, it's difficult to be kind of case by case on individuals.
Yeah, every hour I spent on the phone,
Yeah,
allaying fears, talking through things again, every single hour was worth it.
yeah, I bet. But challenged because of all the other jobs, and I guess it's the communication that doesn't have deadlines, whereas there's deadlines for the audit, there's deadlines for all of those other bits.
Yes, but I would say that was the first thing I would always do, is pick up the phone. I think the difficulty is sometimes when people are remote, you can't see that they're struggling, you can't see that they're worrying.
Yeah,
So I
that's
think
pretty.
that was the biggest difficulty.
Yeah, but it is your absolute priority, and it would be an even bigger priority if you had your time again.
Absolutely.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Leanda, for sharing that whirlwind 12 months. So it's just been over 12 months now. Really appreciate you kind of being so candid in terms of everything that's happened. Are you on LinkedIn or Twitter or anything like that if people want to ask you any questions?
Yep, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Twitter.
Okay, perfect. We'll put some links in. We'll tag you into when we release this. But thanks very much for giving out your time. Really appreciate it. And yeah, all the best over the coming 12 months.
No problem, thank you.